I never played the original Demon Souls, nor Dark Souls, or any of its sequels or spin offs. During the launch of the PS5, mine happened to be bundled with a copy of the Demon Souls remake. I'd heard the game was hard, and that in the PS5 menu, it literally markets itself as the original Brutal Challenge, entirely rebuilt. So I loaded up the game, expecting something tough, ultimately manageable, and then had my expectations crushed. I bounced off the game quickly and hard. I made it through the tutorial and the first half of the first level, not even making it to the first boss before I packed my bags and went back to playing other games. I didn't spare the game another thought, brushing it off as something that just wasn't for me, and let the game sit on my shelf for another 2 years. Eventually, something brought me back to it. That something was Elden Ring. From Software's 2022 mega hit, which sold 12 million copies in its first month, inducted me, and many, many others, into enjoying this style of game. After beating Elden Ring, I was tempted to start again, but it was truly a colossal game, and I was worried a second playthrough so soon after the first would end up being a colossal drag, especially with the game's weaker elements being much more noticeable. So instead, I jumped into Demon Souls again, on a new character. I figured my experiences through Elden Ring would help me overcome the older title, and I was determined, this time, to actually see the game through to its end. Going back to much older and less popular titles after starting with a new and more famous sequel typically produces three drastically different impressions. The first is reverence. Sometimes the older titles are deeper, more complex, and enthralling than the more streamlined and mainstream sequel. A second reaction is dismissal. Sometimes the older titles are less popular because they're much worse games, even if there are some redeeming features. The final style of reaction is a mix of shock and curiosity. Sometimes, later sequels move so far away from where they trace their roots that the two games are barely linked at all. Whether a reboot or simply over enough sequels and releases, the newer titles don't really share anything at all, mechanically or narratively, with the original game. Demon Souls, for its part, produced all three reactions, sometimes separately, sometimes all at once. In many ways, it has several great elements that are missing from the newer titles, while also clearly having so many rough edges that it does ultimately make it a weaker game than any of its follow-ups. It also felt different in a lot of ways as well. There are ideas and gameplay mechanics so unique to itself that aren't necessarily worse, but don't fit in with FromSoft's later releases. What was instantly familiar, however, was the tutorial. A fairly basic level with some standard enemies, and then a boss designed to brutally murder you. Interestingly, the tutorial boss, the Vanguard Demon, is an enemy which would be reskinned in Dark Souls 1, 3, and Elden Ring. Its moveset in this first game is basic, simple, and not actually that difficult to deal with, but with tutorial equipment, a very small room, and the sheer amount of damage he does, it does make it near certain that a newer player will be cleaved in two and sent straight to the Nexus. The Nexus functions as the game's hub world, the first of many, an element all of these games share. Here, you'll meet the level up NPC, the traditional crestfallen soldier archetype, a blacksmith, and an assortment of other merchants and figures who appear throughout the game. You only have access to a single level, and you cannot level up until you beat its boss, the Phalanx. It was here, about 2/3 of the way through the level, where I gave up, and where I first began to notice some significant differences after coming from Elden Ring. The most obvious was the health cap. Losing half your health bar after death seemed like a brutal punishment. It felt mean and cruel during my first foray into the game. But the first level is very clearly balanced around this fact. This is a tutorial level. The enemies are slow, simple, and with a few marked exceptions, deal appropriate damage for the health you have. Later games all have a version of this mechanic, save Bloodborne, where death is punished in some kind of way. Some, like Elden Ring's Rune Arc system, are so optional and forgiving you might not even notice the effects, but others, like Dark Souls 2's hollowing mechanic, do feel very similar. Here in Demon Souls, it's at its most extreme punishment. Balanced for the first level to be sure, and with an easy to find ring, it lowers the effects to only a 25% health reduction. However, when you reach later levels, being trapped in spirit form can make the game feel dramatically more difficult. The next difference was the speed and pace of the combat. Starting with the Knight class essentially locks you into a heavy roll unless you forgo most of your armor. Starting with Dark Souls 2, having an equipment load above 70% would put you in heavy roll territory, but here in Demon Souls, heavy rolling starts at 50%, and the even faster rolls feel much slower compared to anything following Bloodborne. Many have referred to this iteration of the combat as clunky, and that did sometimes feel true, especially when fighting large groups of enemies. But it still ultimately produced that same satisfying feeling of struggle and triumph. Blocking, parrying, and dodging all felt just as satisfying to do here as it did in Elden Ring. The combat felt so similar, even whole animations from Demon Souls seem to have made it to the most recent titles. In this regard, Demon Souls absolutely does stand the test of time, as the combat systems most of the follow-up titles have all recognizably start with this excellent basis. Another difference was healing, and how it works in Demon Souls. It wasn't that noticeable initially, but as I progressed and reached the middle of the game, it had dramatic effects on the difficulty of the entire experience. On a later playthrough, after I had gone through all of the Souls games, some multiple times, these differences felt even more instant and immediately noticeable. Demon Souls uses consumable grass items of varying quality to heal the player, in contrast to the much more rigid systems of flasks healing in Dark Souls 1, 3, Sekiro, and Elden Ring. Early on, when health items and souls to buy health items are more scarce, this isn't that much of a noticeable difference. But for experienced players, health items can pile up so quickly that it removes a key aspect of the game's difficulty. Death by long-term attrition is a key element of Souls difficulty. Bosses and enemies can kill you quickly with a fast combo, but if you can survive the onslaught and heal, then it's back into the fray to do battle once again. Limiting this pool of health means a player can never get too careless, lest they get worn down by attrition. Dark Souls 3 designs many of its best fights around the amount of healing it knows you have. Boss health, damage, and speed can all be tightly tuned around how much punishment the game knows a player will be able to take in the longer term of a fight. By the early and mid-game of Demon Souls, this balance can be immediately broken for any experienced player. You will have so many health items that you'll always be able to manage the consequence of taking a hit. There is never a threat of death by attrition, and the simpler moveset of most enemies and bosses means you have many more windows to heal and recover. In contrast, this system can feel brutally punishing for new players. If you get hit, die, and struggle in the first levels, then you'll find yourself perilously low on these important grasses, with your only options either being to farm them from enemies or buy them with your souls, which is extremely costly and time-consuming in the early game. All subsequent games will provide a player with a consistent and base amount of healing from which they can always rely upon. But in Demon Souls, failures have an immense cost for new players in these early levels. These diametrically opposed effects of the healing system upon newer and experienced players reflect an interesting place Demon Souls sits within the discussion of difficulty and From Software games. It is, by all accounts, the easiest game in the series, with so many elements that allow a player to easily charge through even the most threatening levels and boss encounters. Yet, Demon Souls is hardly recommended as a good starting title, and many, including myself, actually think it's one of the worst ones to start with. Dark Souls and Elden Ring represented radical jumps in popularity for their respective titles. There are a whole host of reasons for why this is, but one of them has to be flexibility. Elden Ring is an open world, and most of its content, especially in the early game, is actually optional. It's nearly impossible to get stuck because you can always go somewhere else that interests you. The game has a few gatekeeper bosses, like Margit, the Fell Omen, but the game is so determined to provide you either ways to bypass them or let you find the tools you need to overcome the challenge. Dark Souls 1, while absolutely more linear and not nearly as flexible as Elden Ring, still allows you to level up from the moment you exit the tutorial, with a first level that is much more cleverly designed, alongside actually providing you checkpoints throughout the level, alongside a decent pool of non-consumable Estus flasks, which the early game is balanced around. If you get stuck on that first level in Demon Souls, you can get hard stuck. You cannot level up to try and ease the difficulty. You cannot go somewhere else until you beat that first boss. Even Dark Souls 1 gave the players the option of starting with the Master Key if they felt like skipping the Taurus Demon. This lack of flexibility cleaves players into two distinct groups, those who can and those who can't. Further, World Tendency, a mechanic unique to Demon Souls, is another element that can push new and inexperienced players away. Dying in human form pushes the World Tendency down to black. One death might not change anything, but after a few failures, you can bet that the additional enemies that spawn will make the level feel noticeably harder. You can stay in soul form to avoid never dying in your human body, but that means you're playing the levels capped at 50% or 75% health. Meaning that, no matter what, struggling players will find the levels getting harder as a consequence of their failure. Experienced players, for their part, might not notice the system exists at all, or interact with it very minimally. Personally, even my first time through, I didn't know this was a mechanic until I was told about it, long after I beat the game. Difficulty, discussion, and balance aside, the first level itself is a very tightly and cleverly designed level. Though the game provides no checkpoints, many of the game's best levels are recursive and densely designed. Shortcuts are used to dramatically shorten the distance between sections, and this kind of design has come to define the Souls series. And while many of these levels are long and sprawling, Demon Souls' best levels stand as peers to some of the series' greatest hits. Eventually, you'll open the main gate, allowing you to challenge the game's first real boss. The Phalanx is essentially an angry sentient blob that cannot attack you, surrounded by smaller sentient blobs that can only attack in one direction. Dark Souls 1 uses many of its early fights to teach the player many of the fundamentals. The Asylum Demon is a basic overview of combat. The Taurus Demon is a lesson on exploiting your terrain. The Bell Gargoyles are a lesson of duo fights, and highlight the value of co-op and summoning. Dark Souls 3 has Gundyr as a tough, but ultimately still reasonable tutorial fight. Father Gascoigne is brutally tough for a mandatory first boss, but he still teaches the player the importance of aggression and parrying. The Phalanx, in contrast, doesn't really teach the player much about anything surrounding the gameplay. He's weak to fire bombs, which the level provides you plenty of, so you could argue he highlights the importance of consumables. But even without them, the fight is trivially easy. Once you've killed the Phalanx, the game does dramatically open up, and you, at last, gain the ability to level up. Here, another fundamental difference between Demon Souls and the follow-up games is revealed. There is no single world, but 5 distinct and separate ones. Each world is divided into 3 separate sections, though typically there are only 2 major levels per world. Each world also typically has 3 bosses, with the final boss of each world being one of the 5 archdemons. Boletaria is the exception to this rule, having 4 bosses and 4 distinct levels. The levels of each world might be dense and recursive and filled with shortcuts, but these shortcuts never intersect with any other level. There is typically 1 entrance and 1 exit. The levels don't overlap with each other. In Demon Souls, the density of the micro-level design doesn't carry over into the broader world design, which is a clear step below the creativity some of the later games display in designing their worlds. These 5 worlds can be tackled in mostly any order, which introduces another problem to the many issues the game already has with difficulty balance. If you can do these levels in any order, then they all need to be roughly equivalent in difficulty. Thus, whichever levels you save for later are going to be crushed, as you'll reach them over-leveled with upgraded gear, combined with a plethora of unlimited quality healing items. Some levels and worlds, like the toxic and poisonous Valley of Defilement, are a little more difficult, but the broad equivalent difficulty of each world contributes to creating a very easy endgame. Another change, which becomes dramatically more noticeable as you progress, is the way weapon upgrading is handled. In all of the games, save Sekiro, where there is no weapon upgrade system, once you reach a certain weapon level, you switch over to needing a rare material. This is still true in Demon Souls. The material requirements to get higher level gear do demand higher quality stones. However, these higher gear levels still also require the older stones. Getting weapons from +8 to +9, or even to +10, require an exorbitant amount of resources. In later entries, as long as you're keeping pace and being reasonably thorough, the materials you need will typically be appropriate to your weapon level. In Demon Souls, I found that I either needed to go to older areas and grind for these lower level items, or spend a significant amount of souls to buy them outright. It's another element of tedium that the later games removed by streamlining the upgrade process. After returning to the Nexus, and spending far too long looking for an NPC you need to talk to actually get the four worlds to open up, I eventually opted to continue with the Boletarian levels, pushing past the Phalanx Demon and onto the Lord's Path, a colossal bridge leading to the heart of the castle. The level is very linear, and the dragon attacks along the main path are a deadly environmental hazard, which can add intense strikes of pressure to certain sections of the level. Guarding the entrance to the inner ward is the massive Tower Knight. The knight is imposing, threatening, and the music does an excellent job of filling the player with dread. Crossbowmen stand above the main sections of the arena, peppering the player with arrows. The best approach is to rush to the second floor of the arena, eliminate the smaller enemies, and then deal with the Tower Knight once he's alone. Mechanically, this is a gimmick fight. You get behind the Colossus, slash his legs until he eventually tumbles over, then slash at his head until he stands up. Repeat until he dies. The boss himself has a very, very simple moveset, and can hardly even reach you if you aren't being mindlessly aggressive when attacking his legs. Despite beating the Tower Knight, you aren't actually able to progress to the next level of Boletaria. To enter the inner ward of the castle, it requires you to hold the soul of an archdemon. This requires you to complete the entirety of one of the four other worlds. The final levels of Boletaria are clearly designed to be endgame content, denser with enemies, with tougher bosses who award the highest amount of souls. You can return to Boletaria after defeating any single archdemon, but structurally, it's best to save it for last, as these levels make for, by far, the best possible climax the game can offer. Having been rebuffed to pushing further into Boletaria, I opted to complete world number 2, Stonefang Tunnel. This world is probably one of the tougher ones, with hard-hitting and tanky enemies, and one of the game's hardest bosses. But it's also filled with a massive amount of weapon upgrade materials, which makes it somewhat essential to at least partially explore early on in a playthrough. Stonefang Tunnel's first level, the Smithing Grounds, is where a number of these early upgrade materials can be found, or outright purchased from an NPC at the start of the level. The regular enemies, the Scale Miners, have hefty health pools and don't stagger against most weapons, but are very vulnerable to piercing damage. Mixed with them are the more annoying Fat Officials, high health and heavy-hitting foes that, if not for the loot they dropped, would be best to skip past. About halfway through the level is another typical Souls-like elevator shortcut, taking you back to the start of the level and unlocking the region's blacksmith in the process. Pushing even further, you'll cool off some lava-blocked paths, and then it's a fairly linear run to the next boss. The Armor Spider continues a trend with most Demon Souls bosses, and that is, most of them are unremarkable and underwhelming. Demon Souls is famous for trending towards gimmick fights, especially over combat challenges, and the Armored Spider feels like a bad mix of the two. You can easily block all of her melee attacks, and space all of her attempts to crush you. Then, you attack, back off, and repeat the process until she spews fire everywhere, forcing you to run away, and wait for a while until you can repeat the tedious and simple process all over again. The Armor Spider attempts to be both a cool gimmick and a combative challenge, and lacks any depth in either category. The gimmick element of the fight makes it feel like you're essentially fighting an angry wall with arms, and the combat is so simple and the boss has so few moves that she's easy as the Phalanx after you've killed all his goons. It's underwhelming, even among Demon Souls boss fights. The fight that follows the Armor Spider is anything but underwhelming, however, though it can take quite a while to reach it. Stonefang's second level, the Tunnel City, is one of the most sprawling, maze-like levels in FromSoft history. The claustrophobic and looping tunnels, combined with few large landmarks to anchor your perspective, make it genuinely difficult to make a map of where you've been and where you might be going. Here, you'll also have your first encounter with FromSoft's most famous NPC, Patches. Already, he's up to his tricks and schemes, attempting to convince you to grab some loot that'll obviously get you trapped by a rather large and immovable flaming bear bug. You'll encounter him again in the Shrine of Storms, where he'll kick you down a hole after convincing you to take a look at the delicious loot that awaits you. Afterwards, he'll return to the Nexus, where he becomes one of the game's most valuable NPCs, selling high-quality healing grasses at by far the lowest price. The Tunnel City offers few, if any, shortcuts back to the Archstone checkpoint, which certainly makes it one of the longest boss runs in Demon Souls, which can be frustrating since the Flame Lurker is almost certainly one of the game's hardest bosses. The Flame Lurker is a true fire demon from the depths of hell. Aggressive, hard-hitting, many of his attacks come with powerful area of effect blasts that can harm you even if you roll out of the way. His attacks also leave burning after effects, and as his health gets lower, his flame of hatred grows even brighter, which, while very visually impressive, can make it harder to see what he's actually up to, especially as his aggression ramps up dramatically in the later half of the fight. The Flame Lurker is a test of pure combat ability, straying entirely away from the gimmick elements that Demon Souls tended towards with most of its boss fights. He's much simpler than many of the bosses that would follow, but he still provides those same sensations, the thrill and euphoric triumph, and the dismay and frustration of defeat. They were just as strong here as they were for many of the fights from other games. The quality of the Flame Lurker fight does not carry over to the final boss of Stonefang Tunnel. Located literally a hallway away, this fight has some of the most dramatic visuals ever, mixed with such an underwhelming gimmick. The Dragon God is perhaps the largest dragon boss fight FromSoft has ever done, and the visuals of the remake make it a genuine spectacle and a wondrous sight to behold. Mechanically, it's one of the easiest and most underwhelming gimmicks of the entire series. At the end of one hallway is a massive ballista, which can be used to take a massive chunk out of the dragon's health. However, if the dragon sees you, he'll crush you, doing massive amounts of damage. Staying out of his sight and slowly chipping away at the debris that blocks your path is the key to success. Once you fired off 2 massive arrows from 2 different ballista, the beast collapses, and you're then free to tap him on the chin a few times to finish him off. FromSoft would adapt this gimmick into Dark Souls' Bed of Chaos fight, and there it gathered infamy as perhaps the worst encounter in the series' history. Here, though, this gimmick's only crime is being underwhelming, especially for such a visually terrifying boss fight. Hunting for the remaining Archdemon souls, and opting not to push into the endgame levels of Boletaria, the next area I ventured to was the Shrine of Storms, an island caught in a torrent of wind, rain, thunder, and lightning. Visually, this might be the single most beautiful level I've played in any video game, with the PS5 remake showing a level of visual fidelity and detail that I don't think any game has come close to. The level's enemies, mostly hordes of skeleton soldiers, are fast and hit hard, and can cause bleeding if they hit too often. However, compared to the scale miners, these enemies stagger much easier and go down in far fewer hits. Critically, these enemies award a hefty amount of souls, especially for a level that can be tackled as soon as you defeat the Phalanx Demon. While Stonefang Tunnel is important to visit for the upgrade materials, the shrine is such a soul-rich region that visiting it early means you can very quickly level up and return to other content that might have been giving you trouble. Early on in this level is also a rematch with the Vanguard Demon. He's not marked as a boss fight, though he won't respawn. He still hits brutally hard and stands perfectly in the way of where you need to go, but the area you have to fight him is much wider, meaning his simple moveset becomes a lot easier to avoid. When you're fighting him, however, flying storm beasts will pepper you with projectile attacks, doing decent damage and occasionally staggering you, which can make it more difficult to keep your focus on the Vanguard Demon, allowing him to blindside you. There's a tunnel nearby the Vanguard Demon, which, when thoroughly explored, will allow you to free an important merchant NPC, Graverover Bilge. He sells late-game healing items as well, and if you miss the encounters with Patches, who sells cheaper items, then he becomes an important substitute for keeping a full stock of healing grass. The second half of this level is filled with tight paths and fights with some hard-hitting Red-Eye Skeleton opponents, as you loop around the outskirts of the island and make your way to the Adjudicator. As a boss, the Adjudicator is really just the less interesting Tower Knight. You hack at his weak spot, an open cut in his belly, and eventually he'll tumble over. Then, you whack at his head and repeat until he dies. Barring the Phalanx, the Adjudicator probably has the simplest moveset in the game. Wide, slow swings that'll easily miss you if you walk forward and then to the right. He's another great creature design, but it's wasted on a bland and repeated gimmick that's already been done better within this very game. The Ritual Path, the second level of the Shrine of Storms, is one of the longest in the entire game, filled with respawning ghosts and high-damage Necromancer or Reaper enemies. The level traps you within tight corridors that give the player little room to maneuver, which is especially frustrating as some of the later ghosts get some high-damage laser attacks. Much like the Tunnel City, there are no real shortcuts to shorten the distance between the start and the end of the level. It's a tight, rigid gauntlet of enemies that you have to engage with every time you die. This kind of checkpointing is an element of design that later games have slowly moved away from. It's a type of difficulty that's more tedious than it is challenging and engaging, as it can feel like you're pushing through a pile of repetitive garbage to get to the part of the game you're actually stuck on. Demon's Souls does have the easiest array of bosses in the series, but the sheer length of these boss runs means that even a few failures can add tens of minutes of dead time per every couple of attempts. The Old Hero is the boss of the Ritual Path, and while not the hardest boss in the game, his damage output and spikes of hyper-aggression can kill a player quite quickly. He's got one of the game's more unique gimmicks, which is that he's blind and can't actually see you. If you move slowly, he won't be able to hear and track you, and he'll wander around the arena, occasionally slashing at nothing. The Thief's Ring, which muffles your footsteps, can even further be an excellent help within this fight, making it even harder for him to identify you and giving you much greater mobility and freedom of movement. Periodically slashing at his legs and then backing away when he gets enraged is the way to go with this fight. When he locks onto you, either after an attack or by poor movement on your end, the fight becomes dramatically more fast-paced, until eventually he loses track of you and resumes his blind wanderings. Overall, it's a decent gimmick fight, and difficult enough to maintain high amounts of tension throughout. What follows the Old Hero is the game's best and most iconic gimmick fight, the battle with the Storm King. Much like with the Dragon God, and as we'll see with both Latria and the Valley of Defilement, a world's third boss fight is typically barely a hallway away from the second. This fight takes place in the most visually impressive arena in the entire series, no question. The wind, rain, lightning, mud, and thunderous atmosphere is instantly compelling. Making your way to the other end of the arena, while being harassed by floating unreachable storm beasts, will eventually take you to the Storm Ruler, a massive blade imbued with the power of the storm itself. With this weapon equipped, you'll now have the range to slaughter the smaller storm beasts, and eventually, the king himself will descend upon the arena. This fight has been adapted twice in the later games, with the fights against Yorm the Giant and Shardbearer Rykard in Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring respectively. This first iteration is simple. The Storm Ruler only has one attack, and the enemies also only have one real counter, with their projectile attacks. Yorm's fight suffers from a similar problem, with there being only one real way to charge and use the Storm Ruler, and Yorm himself having a rather simple moveset. Rykard, as the final iteration of this fight, and one of my personal favorites across the entire series, fixes a number of these problems. Every basic attack from the Serpent Hunter Spear has been imbued with these wind-based powers, varying in speed, damage, and attack range. Rykard is also a much more notable threat when compared to the others, though he is still more spectacle, but he's difficult enough to add a layer of tension that the older fights can't quite manage. However, with the visual upgrades of the remake, the battle with the Storm King is by far one of the most, if not the most visually impressive fights in this series. Remarkable and memorable, it establishes the template for one of the series' best recurring gimmicks. The Tower of Latria is the third of Demon's Souls' various worlds, and its tone, enemy design, and atmosphere, it feels Lovecraftian and oozes eldritch horror. Every single element of Latria, save perhaps the bosses, would fit perfectly alongside Bloodborne's most Lovecraftian levels, like Yahar'gul, the Nightmare of Mensis, and the Fishing Hamlet. There are enemies here that feel eerily similar between the two games. The Mind Flayer, for example, has several attacks that mirror the Brain Suckers from the later game, and the two enemies look eerily similar to boot. While I'd hardly say that Latria inspired all of Bloodborne's overall vibe and tone, it's clear that many of that game's design elements, atmosphere, mood, and creature design, can trace some of their origins back to Demon's Souls. Latria's opening level, the Prison of Hope, is a recursive and maze-like prison built around finding keys and opening locked doors. The actual number of enemies feels surprisingly sparse. Rarely did I find myself fighting more than even one enemy at a time. It's a level that feels more dangerous than it actually is, trading its difficulty for a brutally oppressive mood. It's a good choice, and a welcome change of pace. Both this level and the next, Upper Latria, feel more memorable than many of the others. If the first half of Latria is densely claustrophobic and maze-like, then the world's second level, Upper Latria, trades this approach for a larger, sprawling sense of horror. The sheer scope of the nightmarish suffering that seems to have occurred creates an atmosphere of brutal, brutal oppression, and that is just as strong as Latria's first level. It's somehow both sprawling and massive, while also managing to be incredibly dense and able to loop back onto itself. It's also an incredibly vertical level, on par with the Broom Tower from Dark Souls 2's Crown of the Old Iron King expansion, and the Astral Clock Tower in Bloodborne's The Old Hunters DLC. Upper Latria manages to imply a sense of vastness and sense of greater scale that most of Demon Souls' levels can't quite manage. The enemies of the level are a mix of flying stone gargoyles, who can be rather annoying if they decide to remain in the air and out of melee range, and also more eldritch abominations. Some truly gross and revolting mishmashes of faces and body parts. It's still not quite as densely packed as other levels, but with the limited walking and movement space, where one misstep can mean a long fall to your death, it still means most fights have a level of tension and excitement. The Tower of Latria would be an excellent candidate for the game's overall best world, but it's let down by its thoroughly awful set of bosses. First, capping off the Prison of Hope is the Fool's Idol. Fairly basic, you'll run up to her, take off a huge chunk of her health bar, and then she'll teleport away. When she reappears, she'll summon copies of herself, and only finding the real one will lower the overall health bar of the boss. There's also magic traps that can freeze you in place for a significant amount of time, allowing her and her copies to get a number of free hits. Still, once you get in close, she's fairly defenseless, and it's also fairly easy to identify which version is the real one, as it appears about a second before the copies do. Mechanically, this fight is a much more basic and easier version of the Crystal Sage fight in Dark Souls 3. It's an alright fight in that game, but here it can feel long and tedious, especially when there's more than one twist that makes this fight drag on even longer. When she dies, the Fool's Idol will laugh, and you'll exit the room through the fog wall from which you entered. Then, you'll walk back into the room, and the fight resets, and you have to do it all over again. The gimmick at play is that there's actually an enemy outside the arena constantly reviving her. Following one of the offshoot paths just outside of the boss arena will take you directly to him. And once you kill this enemy, you're free to return to the area and kill the Fool's Idol permanently. The fight the first time through is mostly mediocre, but having to do it once or twice more, adding so much repeated dead time to a fight you've already proven you have the skill to beat, is beyond boring. On subsequent playthroughs, the gimmick might as well not exist, since all players will know to kill the hidden enemy first and only have to deal with the fight one time. It's overall a tedious fight, but at the very least, it's a functional and reasonably balanced encounter, which is something that cannot be said for the next boss encounter. Upper Latria's boss fight is a duo fight against the Man-Eaters, big bestial creatures that have a mix of hard-hitting close-range attacks, charge attacks, alongside magic and in-air attacks. Individually, these creatures are nothing too difficult, harder than the Phalanx, Adjudicator, and Tower Knight, but definitely easier than the Flame Lurker or Old King Allant. Together, however, they create the single most janky, unpolished, and inconsistent fight I've ever seen. Sometimes this fight is brutally hard, sometimes it's shockingly easy, sometimes it's quick, and sometimes it's a long, never-ending slog. At all times, however, it's unbelievably broken. The Man-Eaters can spend upward of a minute just floating in the air, which is especially frustrating as you have a timed window to do damage before the second Man-Eater appears. If you happen to get unlucky, you'll still have to deal with 2 full health bars by the time the second one arrives. Sometimes, both will constantly spam aggressive melee attacks that don't give you a single second to breathe. And other times, one will be so passive that you can spend the whole fight engaging in separate 1v1s. The fight is also incredibly buggy. The Man-Eaters will try to slam you from the air, and freeze for 5 feet above the ground, and then instantly teleport. In fact, the stuttering is the single most consistent element of the entire fight, especially when they're in the air. This fight ultimately feels like you're fighting people with 900 ping who are barely able to connect to the game. It's sometimes a hard fight, but it's definitely one of the worst feeling, and absolutely is unfinished. Once again, the final boss of the world is just a hallway away, and it's one of the game's most interesting gimmicks. The fight with the old monk is actually a PvP fight. Another player can be summoned to be your boss. But if the game is unable to find someone, then you will end up fighting a fairly basic NPC battle against the old monk. The NPC is fairly easy to deal with, but 3 worlds into the game, with unlimited healing and your fully upgraded gear, nearly every fight is ultimately fairly trivial. Compared to the other fights and gimmicks throughout the game, this one isn't too bad. And it's one in which Dark Souls 3 would copy with its Spear of the Church fight in the Ring City expansion. However, as the climax to one of the 5 major worlds, it leaves a lot to be desired. It just doesn't really fit with the aesthetic and atmosphere that Latria had worked so hard to craft. Some of the inspiration for Bloodborne may have certainly come from Latria, but the Valley of Defilement is almost certainly the father of every single swamp level that Hidetaka Miyazaki would go on to build. The first level is claustrophobic and close quarters, a dense ravine, much more filled with enemies than Latria. If you arrive here in the late game, it's a shockingly easy experience. The only thing that feels a little unfair is the horde of small rat enemies that will instantly inflict plague upon you even if they land just a single hit. Compared to Latria's bosses, the Leechmonger, who awaits the player at the bottom of this ravine, is much more visually in sync with the environment and tone of the valley. He's a living husk of leeches with some powerful smash attacks, the ability to regenerate his health, and can inflict a lot of damage over time with many of his leeches. If you come to the valley much earlier in your playthrough, he can be fairly tough, especially with his expanded health pool due to regeneration. However, he still has a fairly simple moveset, and it's fairly easy to get behind him and out of range of most of his attacks. By the standards of the rest of the game, I'd consider the Leechmonger to be definitely in the upper half of the bosses. But compared to some of the more dramatic presentations of the Penetrator, King Allant, and the Flame Lurker, the Leechmonger can leave a little bit to be desired. Once you're out of the tight and dense valley, you'll find the next level, the Swamp of Sorrow, to be a much more open and decompressed level. It's mostly an illusion, though. There's a fairly linear main path you'll follow, with a shortcut along the cave's wall to cut down on some of the walking distance at the end. It feels eerily similar to the bottom of Blighttown, the swamps, down to the same blood-skewing mosquito bugs. Compared to Blighttown, though, it's a lot less threatening. Blighttown feels innately more hostile and alien, and without the ability to fast travel home, there's a building sense of dread as you proceed. You're farther from home than at any other point in the game, and Blighttown is more hostile than any other level that had come before. Neither the Swamp of Sorrow nor the valley itself has any of that magnificent personality or impressive design. Blighttown is remarkable for being one of the linchpins of Dark Souls' entire interconnected world design, being the crossroads between 4 to 5 different entire regions. Blighttown is more than just another swamp level, and the Swamp of Sorrow really doesn't hold a candle to it. The Dirty Colossus is the second boss of the world, and while certainly not a reskin, he feels eerily similar to the Leechmonger. Visually he's a little different, but he's still at least grossly filthy and appropriate to the Valley of Defilement's whole aesthetic. Mechanically, these bosses are both about the same size and fight at similar speeds. The simple moveset doesn't help in diversifying these bosses from each other either. They're both competently made bosses, but nothing more. Maiden Estrella is certainly a remarkable fight, though. It's not particularly good, and it's definitely one of the game's easiest fights, but it is remarkable. There are 3 distinct ways of doing this fight. You can find a good ledge and pepper the Maiden Estrella with arrows until she dies. It'll take a while, and is beyond tedious, but it's doable. You can also jump down into the swamp. That'll near instantly give you the plague, and try to make your way to her. You'll be ambushed and stun-locked by disgusting swamp babies who will trap you as you slowly or quickly die of the plague. The bow and arrow method might be tedious, but the swamp method is downright masochistic. These are both the less obvious paths, and both of these paths actually award an achievement for doing this way, while the main approach does not. The proper way to do this fight is to take the left path and fight Garl Vinland, the NPC who protects the main path to the Maiden. He's got a fairly pitiful amount of health for being part of a fight with an archdemon, and a moveset that's fairly easy to parry, with a number of openings that are pretty easy to exploit. Once you kill him, you're free to take the most direct path to Maiden Estrella, who won't actually fight you if you do it this way. Instead, with Vinland dead, she'll give up, take her own life, and give you the archdemon soul you seek. With 4 or 5 archdemon souls collected, the only thing left to do is return to Boletaria and head to the inner ward of the castle. This level is filled to the brim with enemies, especially powerful Red-Eye Knights, who can easily overwhelm and quickly cut you down. The enemies at this level also constantly drop mountains of the highest quality healing grasses. By this point in the game, I had already had a full stock from the varying grasses. But for struggling players, this level can be an excellent way of farming if souls are scarce. Throughout the level, you're following one of the Fat officials, who first mocks and taunts you in the Tower Knight fight. He blocks the main path, and when you finally catch up to him, he retreats behind a fog wall, with a host of Red-Eye Knights guarding the path to the actual boss arena. When you finally reach the arena, the Fat official stops running and decides to finally do battle. As I waited for the cutscene to end, all I could feel was eye-rolling resignation. I'd fought a dozen of these dudes already in Stonefang Tunnel, and now the game was presenting one as a boss. Had I played the game in the wrong order? The cutscene lingers on the Fat official long enough to instill that sense of resigned expectations, only to instantly twist the knife, or the sword in this case, as a blood-red blade impales the official from the other side of the fog wall, and then an armored knight steps through. The Penetrator has arrived. If I had a nickel for every time I fought a legendary knight who's been corrupted by some dark force, who begins the fight with an enemy impaled on his sword, that he then tosses in your direction, I'd have 3 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it's happened thrice. The Penetrator is the origin of every knightly and humanoid duel, which would come to define the series in later games. Artorias, Gale, the Fume Knight, and a host of others, they all trace their roots here, to the Penetrator and his pointy sword. As far as first attempts go, the Penetrator is a fairly good fight. He's simple and predictable, and his moveset is rather small, even when compared to his direct follow-up in Artorias. But he's still a fight with an enjoyable flow, excellent atmosphere, music, and he's one of the more complicated fights in this first game. What he suffers from is the same thing as all the other later game bosses suffer from, the abundance of healing and the power of endgame equipment. Still, as the last boss before the game's climax, he's an excellent warm-up to the game's true greatest mechanical challenge. But before you can reach that final challenge, however, one last level awaits the player. Unlike the other worlds, which only have 2 full levels, Boletaria has 4. The last, while shorter than average, is still a fairly brutal level, with several NPC invaders, tight hallways, and a fire-breathing dragon to ensure that there's always at least some pressure on the player. Without any shortcuts, and an unbelievably slow elevator to the actual boss room, this level is a candidate for the longest boss run in the series, which can be especially frustrating since the Old King Allant fight is by far the hardest and most complex in the game. While I've praised much of the foundation set by many of the game's bosses, it's hard to argue that these fights really stand the test of time, even when compared to the other older games in the series. Even the Penetrator doesn't really compare to the complexity and balance of even the immediate follow-up in Artorias. These fights are much simpler than anything to come, and are mainly prototypes for what the later games will build off of. Old King Allant is the exception to this rule. Sure, he's simpler than most of the major fights from the newer games, but compared to the bosses from Dark Souls 1 and 2, Allant easily stands as the worthy contemporary. He has the most complicated moveset in the game, with some fairly fast combos, a number of ways to close the distance on the player, and a visually impressive area of effect shockwave attack. Further, he even has a grab attack that will level you down if he grabs you. It's fairly blatantly telegraphed, but the move has a very permanent consequence regardless of the outcome of the fight. Once defeated, this version of Allant is revealed to be nothing more than a demonic shade, and the real Allant speaks to you, marveling at your strength, and wonders aloud about your appetite for souls. With Allant dead, and the 5 worlds completed, when you return to the hub area, the glass will shatter at the center, and the bottom of the Nexus will open up to you. Once you talk to the Maiden in Black, the NPC who's been helping you the entire game, and allowing you to level up, you'll immediately begin a cutscene that'll take you to the end of the game. The Maiden beckons the Old One to come forth, and the Ancient Demon allows you to enter him and confront the real Allant, who tries to seduce you into his way of thinking. This fight is, by far, the easiest fight in the series. This true version of Allant is pathetic, weak, and sad. He's been corrupted so thoroughly and descended so deeply into nihilism that he's not even really a shell of his former self. He's an empty husk. All he can do is vaguely flop around, doing pitiful damage even if he somehow manages to hit you. It's hard to tell if this is a good boss fight. Thematically and narratively, it succeeds at exactly what it sets out to do. Alon's decline is the point of the entire boss fight, and the feeling of being underwhelmed is absolutely intentional. As a deliberate anticlimax, it's certainly memorable, but I feel it goes just too far in turning this fight into a joke. Dark Souls 1 highlighted the decline of Gwyn by making him parryable. He's the only boss in the first game where it's even possible to do so. Without parrying, Gwyn is one of the game's tougher challenges. With parrying, he's much, much easier. Gwyn has his own issues, and Miyazaki later stated that he regrets making Gwyn so easy to parry and bypass the encounter entirely. But as a more balanced anticlimax, I think he works better than the lot mechanically, even if this final fight does indeed succeed at exactly what it sets out to do. The game has two different endings, both of which harken back to the core themes and ideas the game wishes to discuss. Every Soulsborne game is linked thematically, and they all share a number of the same ideas, themes, and views, from the importance to embracing change, to how religious institutions are often corrupted, usurped, and used as a means of controlling the masses, or the way in which immortality causes stagnation and diminishment of the self and the world, how the elite cling to power at the cost of everything around them. The particulars of each game differs in what main theme they wish to discuss and focus on, but there is always some overlap into what's being discussed. Another video essayist, particularly Noah Caldwell-Gervais, has highlighted the influence on Buddhism on the outlook of these games. Sekiro is the only one that explicitly makes this connection, but once you look at these games from that Buddhist angle, it's impossible not to see the myriad of ways that the themes and games link back to that religion. Dark Souls and its sequels are, aesthetically and mechanically, the most obvious follow-ups to Demon Souls. Artistically, Dark Souls borrows its general melancholic fantasy, style, atmosphere, and visual design. Mechanically, the same is true. Dark Souls combat, especially on the player's end, feels near identical. Jumping from one game to the other is no different than putting on a slightly different outfit. Despite the similarities between them, however, Dark Souls is not at all the closest to Demon Souls narratively and thematically. Dark Souls is a game about stagnation, about the costs of holding on and the importance of letting go. There are absolutely a wide array of shared thematic elements between them, but at its heart, Demon Souls is a tale about corruption, and to a lesser extent, religion, making the game it is closest to Bloodborne in what they both want to discuss. It was Alon's ambition that corrupted him. The power that he sought turned him into a great demon, awoke the Old One, and put humanity down a path to extinction. Maiden Estrella, herself a noble saint, descended into demonhood because she was convinced only with such power could she heal the pain of her people. Each demon you slay tempts you with the phrase, "You shall obtain the power of a demon soul, and power beyond human imagination." All game long, the game tempts you with the very power that corrupted the bosses you now put out of their misery, and one of the game's endings directly harkens back to this corruption. Unlike the later games, Demon Souls does not have a complicated pantheon of gods and goddesses. There is one god, the Creator, an omnipotent and divine being, who on the first day granted mankind souls. Then, on the second, he created the Old One, a soul-devouring demon, which had the power to bring mankind to a slow extinction if awoken. That's what the game tells you in its two introductions, but there are a number of hints throughout the game that God is actually the Old One, and that its worshippers have been deceived. It's not quite Lovecraftian, but there are definitely echoes to the way the Healing Church in Bloodborne grew to revere the Great Ones for their cosmic power. The Old One certainly has connections to the Divine, whether as God or as a corrupted version of him, tainted by the actions of humanity. When you slay this true version of Alont, the game presents you with two options. In the first, you can walk away and allow the Maiden in Black to lull the Old One back into an eternal slumber. Humanity is saved, and you rise as a new Monumental, holding the fractured world together with your unprecedented power. Despite being the good ending, it feels at odds tonally with the rest of the game. It's strangely unsatisfying. Every other figure in this story was corrupted by the godlike power they held. Alant, Astrea, even potentially God itself have been tainted by how rotten and corrupted this world has become. And here you are, the hero, doing exactly what they did, devouring souls in an ambitious pursuit of power. Maybe you came to save the world, or maybe, as the intro to the game suggests, you came for the power of the demon souls, as so many heroes did before you. The good ending walks back all of this and totally derails everything the game is trying to say about ambition and power. You get to have this ascension to godhood or near godhood free of consequence. Everyone else just wasn't good enough. Much like the rest of the game's moral systems, world, and player tendency, this ending feels half-baked. There is no catharsis or thematic justification for what the good ending entails. Contrast this to one of Bloodborne's 3 endings, the Sunrise ending. It's by far the easiest ending to get, and all the others require fighting an entire extra boss or 2. Bloodborne is, at its core, about the ascension to eldritch godhood. In the game's most hidden ending, you fight one of the outer gods as you begin your own ascension. Ultimate and total corruption for a character who bathed themselves in violence, bloodlust, and ambition. The Sunrise ending in Bloodborne is, to me, the good ending. It requires a rejection of this ascension entirely. To submit yourself to Gehrman's blade, to reject the drive to violence that the game revels in. When Gehrman kills you in the Hunter's Dream, you wake up in the real world, free. In Bloodborne, your character was unwillingly conscripted into being a hunter, and only putting an end to a nightmare frees you from this contract. Though the game bathes in bloodlust and violence, it takes a number of extra steps to actually succeed in ascending to godhood. Despite by far being the easiest ending to achieve, the Sunrise ending is actually the least common for most players. Some will succeed at ascending to godhood, and some will fail and be puppeteered by the moon presence. But fewer choose to just walk away. Like the good ending of Demon Souls, the Sunrise ending of Bloodborne runs contrary to the natural impulse of the game. But unlike Demon Souls, however, the Sunrise ending doesn't actually contradict any of the themes of the game itself. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, so to get the Sunrise ending requires a rejection of power. In Bloodborne, what makes your character different isn't that you're immune to the corruption of absolute power, but rather that you had the strength of character to resist every impulse to seize that power for yourself. Here, the story of Bloodborne is reframed, with your character presented as the positive antithesis and counterpoint to the corrupted figures of Bloodborne's world. It's cathartic and satisfying, and perfectly fits with the story being told. I imagine most players in Demon Souls will choose the good ending, though it's impossible to say with any certainty, since only the evil ending offers a trophy with stats to track. Despite this, the evil ending is by far more narratively interesting. It's just, unlike Bloodborne, the game doesn't mechanically push the player into the mindset of instinctively choosing the evil ending. By framing the decisions as a personal choice, Bloodborne reveals that more players by far opted for power in the end. But the way Demon Souls does it, as framing the choice as a larger and less personal set of options between saving the world and destroying it, it's easy to see why so few players will opt to do the obviously bad and evil thing, especially when the good ending lets them keep all their power free of consequences. It's frustrating because the bad ending is so obviously in keeping with the tone and storytelling of the game. You choose to kill the Maiden in Black and embrace the Old One for the exact same reason you killed every other demon: power. Absolute and total power. You choose to pursue it, and this is the inevitable outcome, regardless of your intentions starting out. It's a cathartic tragedy. Not even you were exempt from the festering corruption of this world. Your ambition, along with everyone else's, ensured humanity's slow and inevitable extinction. Interestingly, one of the motivations for the evil ending has echoes of the Lord of the Frenzied Flame ending from Elden Ring. As you fight this true husk of Alant, he proclaims, "Surely you have seen it for yourself, the pain and suffering that fills this world. But fight poison with poison. God is merciful, and so created the Old One. The Old One will feed upon our souls, and put an end to our tragic realm of existence." And, as he dies, he states, "You fool, don't you understand? No one wishes to go on." Hyetta, the NPC most associated with the Flame of Frenzy, outside the completely insane corpse puppeting Shibiri, states that, quote, Those who gave me grapes howled without words, saying they wish they were never born. Become their lord, take their torment, despair, their affliction, every sin, every curse, and melt it all away, as the Lord of Chaos. No more fractures, no more births. This isn't nihilism, which supposes nothing matters, but rather an extreme form of antinatalism. Antinatalists argue that the suffering of life and the pain a person might endure is so great that even having children is a moral wrong. Life itself isn't worth the weight of the suffering it creates. Allant and Hayeta take this even a step further than that, wanting to end all life in a single stroke, thereby ending all suffering, and returning the universe to a more peaceful and natural state. They're wrong, and in Elden Ring, Malenia offers an excellent counter-argument to Hayeta. Antinatalism isn't at all the main motivation that most players will have for joining the Old One, but it's interesting to see that many of the ideas that Demon's Souls directly dealt with, philosophically, would carry over in such major ways to such a massive game over 13 years later, as a root of what will become one of Elden Ring's most iconic endings. Demon's Souls is, ultimately, perhaps the weakest Soulsborne game. It's got a few bad ideas that later games would learn from and avoid, alongside a lot of unrefined implementations of a number of good and great ideas. It is, in most respects, a rougher game than any other in the series, save perhaps Dark Souls 2. Yet, it succeeded at so much of what it set out to do. It established a core combat system that still very obviously persists in successor titles as late as even Elden Ring. Its world isn't as impressive as the follow-ups, but it established the principles of dense and recursive level design that would be used to create many of the series' best hits. Its bosses are simple and very often feel like prototypes, but at their best, they still provoke those deep feelings of success and satisfaction upon victory. Narratively, though flawed in its endings, it helped establish a number of the bedrock themes and ideas that all the later games would draw upon and discuss in one way or another. Demon's Souls absolutely isn't perfect, and it's very flawed in many ways. But much bigger franchises have started from much humbler beginnings, and Demon's Souls does deserve to be regarded as an overall quality game, and is worth playing, if you've experienced either another Soulsborne title or are just a fan of the series in general. Referring to the title of the essay, it's a pretty good start.